Hey guys, Mrs. Carraz here. Today we're looking at Chapter 20, Section 2, the Spanish-American War. Alright, so to begin, we need to take a look at Cuba. So in 1492, aka when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, Cuba went under Spanish rule. And from pretty early on, Cubans believed that the Spanish were too harsh as rulers. And there was an uprising in Cuba from 1868 to 1878, but ultimately that ended and the Spanish won. Another uprising begins in 1895, and that's the one that we're going to worry about right now. So the Spanish reacted to this uprising with a policy of reconcentration. So basically what they did is force large numbers of people to move into detention camps for military or political reasons. In this case, we're talking about political reasons, right? Joseph Marti, who was Cuba's greatest poet at the time, led refugees to the U.S. and asked U.S. officials to help the rebels and really help people in Cuba overthrow the Spanish government. So here's how America responds. So the people, the American people, they feel empathetic and they want to help the Cuban rebels, right? We were once colonists struggling under a power that we disagreed with. We feel their pain. We also, on the less warm and fuzzy side, know that America has a lot of money invested in Cuban industries, and we want to protect those investments, right? So a war is probably not the best way to go about things. So this is how the people feel. But when it comes to presidents, so both President Cleveland and McKinley really tried to stay neutral. They didn't want to get involved in this whole situation that was going on in Cuba. But we get some other forces here in the States pushing the American public, and that's going to push our politicians as well. So Joseph Pulitzer, who we studied previously, and William Randolph Hearst, who is Pulitzer's greatest competitor, the Hearst Building is actually just a few blocks from us, sparked American interest in Cuba by writing sensational headlines that gained sympathy for the rebels, right? And if the people are now going to feel even more upset about what's going on in Cuba, it's not long before they're going to really push for the politicians to take some sort of action and help out. And what do you know, what do you say? We're going to get a reason to join this fight. So, in 1898, fighting breaks out in Havana, Cuba. And McKinley at this time orders a battleship called the Maine to go to Cuba to protect Americans that are living there and American property that is there, right? The Maine is not there to fight per se. It's not there in an offensive capacity, more of a defensive one, right? They're going to protect our American interests should the need arise. So that's the intention. But then on February 15th, 1898, the Maine explodes and sinks, and 260 men die in the process. No one knows exactly what happened, but for one reason or another, they decide that Spain is to blame. And now that we have lost 260 of our men because of this whole situation involving Cuba, the American public is saying, like, yeah, we need to enter this fight. Obviously, we are being impacted. It's not just that we're feeling bad for others. We ourselves are suffering. Let's join this fight. So in April of 1898, we declare war on Spain, and this will become known as the Spanish-American War. All right, might seem slightly unrelated, but it isn't. So the Philippines are a chain of islands in the Pacific near China. Just like Cuba, the Philippines were also under Spanish control at this time. So now, remember, we backtracked a little bit historically. We're going back to the time where Theodore Roosevelt was the Secretary of the Navy. And his big idea was to attack the Philippines as soon as war broke out, right? Just because our conflict with Spain started because of what was happening in Cuba doesn't mean that fight has to be restricted to Cuba. It is us versus Spain, and we can attack any of their territories that we see fit. So on May 1st, we follow through on Roosevelt's idea. Commodore George Dewey leads an attack on the Philippines, and this is obviously a surprise attack because the entire Spanish squadron in Manila Bay, which is in the Philippines, was sank by a small American fleet. So we're immediately getting an advantage here. So now, at this time, again, we're focusing on Cuba because it was the most direct, link to the war for us. But at this time, Filipinos were also in rebellion. They did not want the Spanish to rule them either. And the U.S. says, hey, this seems like an opportunity for us, right? There was this big rebellion in Cuba. If we help the rebels, everyone's like, we're going to be better off. Same idea here in the Philippines, right? So Commodore Dewey and Emilio Aguinaldo, who is a Filipino rebel leader, they joined together, and their goal was to help the U.S. take control of Manila and the other Philippine islands, get out of the control of the Spanish. Alright, so that is what's going on in the, more western side of the Pacific, I suppose. But now let's get back to Cuba. So here we have the entrance of the Rough Riders, and the Rough Riders are a group of soldiers who were led by Theodore Roosevelt. And these guys fought and won many really important battles in Cuba. We'll look more at their implications, I guess, what they did in the war overall over the next few days. So, on top of the work being done by the Rough Riders, we have U.S. ships trapping and destroying the Spanish fleet in Cuba. Ultimately, Spain surrenders Cuba. They say, yeah, this part of this battle is over. We're not going to win that back. Shortly thereafter, U.S. seized control of Puerto Rico, and now that we're kind of gaining all of these major Spanish holdings, it's pretty clear the U.S. has won the Spanish-American War. So in December of 1898, we declare peace between the U.S. and Spain, and here are some of the conditions in the treaty, right? So Spain has to formally acknowledge Cuban independence. Cuba has nothing to do with Spain anymore. Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Guam, and I want to say Wake, but I could be wrong, would all become U.S. territories, okay? And in exchange for these territories, we're not just going to take them, we're going to be good sports. The U.S. pays $20 million to Spain. So now, here's the feeling on this, right? And we've looked at those ideas of isolationism, expansionism, and imperialism, right? We looked at that previously. So here's the feeling when we're thinking about American expansionism, because now, to backtrack, right, we have all these territories that are technically ours now. Here's what people are thinking about that. So a lot of people are against the idea of expanding. Because first of all, if we're taking on colonies, that means we're taking away another nation's independence, right? We fought for our own independence. It seems a little hypocritical to turn around and, put someone else in the position we were in when our nation began. Another idea against expansionism is that, well, our Declaration of Independence, right, says that all people have a right to self-government. And if we're colonizing, we're imposing on that idea. Then there's also the factor that if we're acquiring colonies, we're bringing on the risk of future wars, right? Exactly like Spain did for itself. If Spain hadn't been involved with Cuba, we wouldn't have gone to war with them in the first place, right? So do we want to open ourselves up to that risk? That becomes part of the question. But then looking at the other side of the spectrum, people who were in favor of American expansion. So they thought that if we expand, we're providing a lot of new business opportunities, right? And that sounds like mercantilism to me, or, I'm seeing links anyway. But the bottom line is if you have more territory, there are more resources, there are more people you can do business with, right? Another good thing is that if we expand, we're going to get important military bases in the event of a global conflict. I'm not saying that the next chapter is World War I, but hint, hint. And finally, if we're expanding, right, it doesn't mean we're setting up colonies the way Britain set up colonies. We have democratic ideals, and we can influence other territories in a way that is also democratic, right? we could spread our good values across the world. That's the idea. So, to address this issue of how we should expand, specifically in relation to Cuba, we get the Platt Amendment. And in 1902, our U.S. Congress forced Cuba to add the Platt Amendment to its constitution. And we're going to look at the Platt Amendment in depth in class. So basically, the Platt Amendment limited Cuba's power to make its own treaties or borrow money. The U.S. is going to have somewhat of a say there. It gave the U.S. the right to intervene in Cuba's affairs, and we'll see to what extent. And it also said that the U.S. could have a naval base in Guantanamo Bay, which is in Cuba. Now, Cuba's not technically a colony of ours. The Platt Amendment makes Cuba a protectorate of the United States. And a protectorate is an independent country whose policies are controlled by an outside power. If that seems confusing, that's okay. I promise we'll talk about it more. So, this is the last slide for today. So, in addition to making plans for Cuba, we need to make plans for the Puerto Rico and the Philippines, right? So, in 1900, we passed the Foraker Act, which establishes the government in Puerto Rico. And basically, it sent a U.S.-appointed governor to rule Puerto Rico. And basically, we said that Puerto Rico would have limited self-rule. Basically, they're taking control of themselves, but we have a large say in what's going on there, too. We also try to, lay claim to the Philippines. And Filipinos really don't like this. They're feeling betrayed because they're saying, listen, we were rebelling against Spanish authority. You said you would help us. And you just put us under your control? That does not make sense, right? So, shortly after the Spanish-American War, Aguinaldo led a war against the United States for Filipino independence. So again, just reasserting what they fought for previously, right? We want to be free. We want to be on our own. That war ended in 1901 with an American win, and in fact, the Philippines did not win their own independence until 1946. So we're seeing the U.S. is certainly expanding. Is everyone else happy about it? Meh. That's a question we'll explore. But for now, that closes us up. Have a great night, guys.